on, everybody. It's time to continue our study called Whiplash, Surviving Life's Twists and Turns. We're taking a look at this Old Testament hero named Joseph. Love this guy. He is teaching us so much. So welcome back to the Compass Church, all of you at all campuses. So glad you're with us. Recently, I was at a restaurant having dinner by myself. I had my computer there, was working on my sermon preparation as I was eating, having a delightful time. Now, my wife tells me that's weird, dining alone. In fact, she thinks it's a little sad. And I just told her, well, to each his own. You know, your sadness is my delight. I loved it. What do you think? Well, I was eating my dinner alone with great victory. I had ordered a salad. I didn't want a salad. I never want a salad. But I had ordered a salad because it was the right thing to do. And I had already decided I'm not even going to look at the dessert menu. Dessert is not happening tonight. Night of great victory. When all of a sudden, the server came to the table next to me with the most glorious sundae I have ever seen in my life. Friends, there were billowing scoops of vanilla ice cream smothered with hot fudge and hot caramel, sprinkled with fresh pecans, velvety waves of whipped cream and a cherry on top. It was a work of art. And I'm like, oh. I said, don't even look at it, Jeff. I looked at it. Don't look. I struggled even with staring it down. This was what I wanted. Oddly enough, the server walked away from the table with the sundae and came my way. The server put it right in front of me and said, would you be interested in this sundae? Apparently there's been a little misunderstanding and we've made a sundae that doesn't have a home. We'd love to give it to you free of charge. Oh. Friends, this was the perfect temptation, and I was struggling immensely when the server must have seen my struggle, and he added these words. He's like, come on, buddy, help me out. Don't make me throw away a perfectly good sundae. That was the final blow. For his sake, I said yes and gobbled it up. Man, was it delicious. But it's an example of my failure in resisting temptation. It was the perfect temptation, really. A perfect sundae, put right in front of me, its availability right there, free of charge. I mean, that's speaking my language. And then the call to help him out made eating it a noble thing of selfless service. Yeah, perfect temptation, and I made a perfect fall. We need to talk about temptation, because temptation is very real. What is temptation? Temptation is when desire overcomes conviction. Friends, we all live with conviction. These premeditated decisions about how we should live, about how God wants us to live. And it's amazing how conviction can be strong, but fleshly desire, even stronger. Now, for some, food is not the temptation. Maybe your temptation is procrastination or laziness or just wasting time. Maybe your temptation is with lying, or maybe it's one of the big three: money, sex, and power. You know, money is a big one where we struggle to give in to temptation to gain money in less than noble ways. Or we struggle to not spend money. We just compulsively are buying things or gambling. For others, it's sex, and sex comes in a number of temptations. There's the temptation to just have lustful thoughts that get out of control, or pornography, or diving into a sexual encounter outside of marriage. You know, God made sex as a beautiful gift to be enjoyed in the context of a marriage, and some people ignore that. Power can be expressed by saying words that are unkind as you're abusively leading someone or treating someone, or power can be words that are boastful, that just launch out of you. Friends, whatever the flavor of your temptation, it's a real deal we must learn to face, because the consequences to falling to temptation are great. Recently, I'm aware of many pastors who shipwrecked their lives and ministry because they fell to temptation, one sort or another. The cause of Christ was damaged because of their inability to win the battle with temptation. Now, it's not always a complete life devastation. Sometimes it's just a loss. Not devastating, but a loss nonetheless. A loss of respect in the eyes of family members for you, because your life isn't as beautiful as it would have been had you gained more victory in that area. And so whether it's complete devastation of one's life due to that failure, or just a loss of impact and respect, of beauty, we don't want to fall. We can't fall. We must learn how to face temptation and, with God's help, find victory. And friends, our hero Joseph is going to show us the way. Joseph is about to experience a temptation that many would say was irresistible. But with great wisdom, he will show us how we too can have victory. So, you ready? Last week, let me go back to the beginning. Week 1, actually, we took a look at the wild ride that can happen with family life. And then week 2, last week, was the wild ride in our work life. And this week, we're looking at the wild ride found in resisting temptation. You may recall that last week we took a look at 2 different places where Joseph worked. We looked at his employment under Potiphar back when he was a slave, and we looked at his employment in the prison system as the deputy warden. Back last week I told you, I promise we'll find out how he got in prison, and that's exactly what we're looking at today. We're going back to Potiphar's house and going to learn about what went down that resulted in him going from Potiphar's house to prison. Sound good? And so, in this passage, Joseph is a slave to Potiphar. Let's find out what happens. Genesis chapter 39, starting in verse 6. Now, Joseph was well built and handsome. And after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." But Joseph refused. Wow. Talk about forward, huh? Let's think about this. Joseph is, he arrived at the age of 17, so maybe some years have passed. Maybe he's 19 years old. He's a good-looking dude. And along comes Mrs. Potiphar. Now, I think it's fair to speculate that she was an attractive woman. Potiphar had a lot of money and power, and sometimes those with money and power can win themselves a beauty. So imagine, if you will, this young man who's probably lonely has this attractive woman come to him and throw herself at him, just saying, "Come to bed with me now." And amazingly, with this immense temptation, Joseph refused. Friends, we got to get into how he found the resolve to resist a temptation that would have been so easy to fall to. Well, before we do, though, I want to make an interesting observation. Reminder, we're in Genesis chapter 39. We skipped over chapter 38. The previous chapter is kind of a strange chapter. It's a chapter not involving Joseph in the midst of Joseph's story. Why would the writer infuse this chapter about Joseph's brother, Judah, right before this one? Well, let me tell you why. Judah provides us context and contrast. Judah fails in sexual temptation. Joseph is victorious. Well, let me tell you just a brief overview of what happens in Genesis 38. Joseph's older brother, Judah, is on a business trip. Again, they were in the sheep herding business. Well, apparently they had to take the sheep to a distant town to have them shorn. And so Judah was away from the family, away from town. And on this business trip, as he's walking into this town, he sees a prostitute. And the prostitute is inviting him. And this is a moment of truth for Judah. This is a moment of temptation. And friends, he fell. Being away from family and away from accountability and having this ready opportunity, it was too much for him, and he gave in to the temptation. He slept with the prostitute, and his life blew up. You say, did he get caught? Oh, man, so much more than just getting caught. We find out that prostitute, unbeknownst to Judah, was his daughter-in-law in disguise. Women and prostitutes in particular, they would wear veils over their face. And this prostitute happened to be his daughter-in-law. And friends, not only did he unknowingly sleep with his daughter-in-law, she got pregnant with twins. And friends, here Judah finds his sin dragged out in the public in the most humiliating, epic way. And as you can imagine, it was a pain he lived with for the rest of his life. Loved those two sons or grandsons, the twins, what would you call them? Loved them, but they were a constant reminder of his perversion and fall to temptation. In light of Judah's failure, Joseph's victory looks all the more beautiful. Think about it. Joseph is further away. He is far from home in another country, Egypt. And no one knows. And he doesn't even have a family anymore. There's just so many more reasons for Joseph to feel the freedom to indulge. And yet he follows God and says, I will not do it, where his brother fell and messed up his life. So let's dive into Joseph's story. Let's try to figure out what led to his capacity to win the day with temptation, to refuse this offer made to him by Potiphar's wife. Well, to help you see two things, I want to use some props. There are going to be 2 points to Joseph's strategy. The first is see, and the second is flee. And I'm going to use some roadside props. I had an interesting experience. I was picking up my daughter from the airport and driving on the expressway really fast. And we got to where I wanted to get off the expressway, but it was construction area and those big concrete barriers were in place and it was raining and misty. And so I'm like, I'm supposed to exit here. Can I exit here? And then all of a sudden I saw this break between the concrete barriers where they had created a way for me to exit. And so I kind of swerved over, and as I did, I saw a flash of orange, like I was passing some cones maybe. It was difficult to see. My daughter saw better than I. She goes, Dad, that wasn't an exit. And sure enough, I realized I was now in the construction area. Boom, 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 boom. I'm driving around like a crazy man. It's a wonder we didn't die. Thankfully, I brought the car to a stop eventually, had to turn it around and find my way out of driving on top of road construction. Now, that could have been so much worse. There could have been a massive hole we fell into. You know, that happens sometimes. Temptation is like a huge hole that your car can fall into on the road of life. And how do we avoid it? 2 things, see and flee. See, we're going to use this windshield squeegee to remind us of the importance of a clear windshield. One of my problems on that day was I couldn't see clearly. The rain and the fog, it was steaming up the car, and my visibility was poor. So this will be about seeing clearly. And then the hazard warning will be about stay away, flee the danger. Okay, sound good? So let's start with what you got to see. In fact, Joseph speaks to Potiphar's wife, Mrs. Potiphar. He speaks to her and says, what you're offering is a bad idea for a number of reasons. We're going to look now at verse 9, where it points to 4 different things that Joseph sees clearly. And because of what he sees, he knows he can't do this. Can I just point out that sometimes in a moment of temptation, we don't see clearly. We don't think clearly. The opportunity is distorted to where what's really dumb becomes really inviting. A lot of people, after they fall, they say, what was I thinking? Well, your mind was clouded. You're drunk with desire, causing you to not see the reality of what you're doing. Joseph saw clearly. First thing he saw clearly was loss. See the loss. We see in verse 9, he says this, no one is greater in this house than I am. What is he saying there? Joseph had been promoted by Potiphar until he became the estate manager. I mean, he had been blessed with a very good situation in that home. And he's reflecting on all the blessing he's had, and he realizes this one decision could blow that all up, ruin it all. Friends, do you ever think about what you could lose if you really continue down the path of temptation and into sin? Usually we don't. Usually in those moments of temptation, our vision is not clear, and we don't realize the disaster ahead. Well, one of the things we can do is spend some time reflecting on, if I continue in this path, if I say yes to this opportunity, where does it lead? What losses, what tragedies will I incur as a result? Spending time meditating and thinking about where that path leads is such a helpful way to see clearly and to not be duped by the deceitfulness of sin. What else did he see? He also saw the hurt. It says in verse 9, Joseph again speaking, he says, my master has withheld nothing from me except you, Mrs. Potiphar, because you are his wife. What is he realizing? He's thinking of the other people affected, and he's like, listen, this Potiphar has been actually good to me, all things considered. And the only thing he has denied me is you, and appropriately so, because you're his wife. And Joseph is thinking of the devastation that would come to this man, his now friend, if he did this. Friends, we too should think of the hurt. We should see the hurt we would cause others. People are always involved, and there's always hearts that are damaged as a result of our sin. We want to make it think, this is just me. No, it doesn't affect anybody. Oh, it does. Whether it's present family who have to grieve your failure, or whether it's future family that you don't even know yet. But people are always impacted, and bringing them to mind and your love for them will help you see clearly in the moment of temptation. Joseph also sees the evil that this act is. In verse 9, it continues. Joseph says, how could I do such a wicked thing? Joseph realizes that this opportunity to sleep with Mrs. Potiphar is downright evil. It's wicked, he calls it. In that Egyptian culture, very far from God, they probably wouldn't have said that. They would have said, oh, no, this is just having fun. If we can get away with it, how exciting would that be? So it is in our culture, These days, what God calls perversion from his ways and evil, our culture, our media, it normalizes it, sometimes glamorizes it, to where it's not a big deal. This is just how people roll. It's how we have fun. We can't lose sight of what these temptations are in God's eyes. They're evil. It's rebellion against his authority. And don't fall into the trap of saying it's no big deal. It is to God. So Joseph, so far, he can see clearly. He can see that there's loss involved in my life if I do this. There's hurt involved with others if I do this. And there's evil. This is evil that's being offered to me. And one more. He could see the Lord. Friends, the most important thing to see when facing temptation is God himself. Again, still in verse 9, he says, how could I sin against God? God. Joseph knew. Remember, it said the Lord was with him. Joseph knew God is still with me in Egypt, and I love the Lord above all else. And right now, he's watching to see what I'm going to do. And his motivation to honor God in this moment was huge, and the reason he had victory. So often, we don't see God in the moment of our temptation. The windshield of life is so fogged over that as we look at the opportunity, God's a million miles away. Friends, we must press in to experience the presence of God throughout our day, enjoying his nearness and his love. And the closer we are with God, the more we'll be able to resist temptation because we see him right there and we love him. Now, if we drift far from God, if relationally we're not walking with the Lord very closely, we are vulnerable because we'll never even think of him in our moment of temptation. Joseph, he could see the loss, he could see the hurt, he could see the evil, and he could see the Lord. And now let's go to the second. Remember, it's see and flee. Well, he had some fleeing to do. Turning now to verse 10. It says, though she, that's Potiphar's wife, though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. This is the avoid temptation part. Part of fleeing is don't even be near her. Do you see that decision? He's like, how can I avoid this woman? Or in the case of a hazard marker, what's another route I can take around so I avoid getting too close to disaster? Friends, we've got to think about that. Say, I know where I'm vulnerable. How can I change how I approach life to avoid as much temptation as possible? Can't avoid it all, but we can avoid some. Now, in the good old days, I used to say things like, you got to avoid that bar, you got to avoid that store, you got to avoid that establishment, go a different way. The problem is these days in our internet online world, avoiding is more difficult than ever. So often our struggle with temptation is virtual. It's available to us right online. And so avoiding becomes more challenging. But we got to think about it and say, what can I do to minimize my exposure to temptation? There are a lot of products, online filters and services that help people avoid temptation. There are some filters that keep us away from inappropriate sites. There are others like Covenant Eyes that actually link us to an accountability partner. So everywhere we go online is sent to a friend we trust. What are we doing? We're avoiding being alone in the sense that they're seeing where we're going. Friends, these are ways that we can avoid temptation. So do your research, come up with a plan, minimize temptation by avoiding it whenever possible. But sometimes you just can't avoid it all. And that's what happens to Joseph. Though he's trying to avoid Mrs. Potiphar, on this fateful day, he wasn't able to. Verse 11, it says, one day he went into the house to attend to his duties. None of the household servants were inside. And she, Mrs. Potiphar, she caught him by his cloak and said, come to bed with me. Now she's not only speaking, she's grabbing him physically. But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. She's not letting him say no. She's grabbing him, and he's like, what am I going to do? And in desperation, he just kind of pulls off his cloak. Now, I should tell you that in that day, they had an outer garment and then they had undergarments, like a t-shirt and underwear. And so this poor guy, as he leaves his outer garment, is running out of the house in his underwear. Humiliating, embarrassing, but wise. Friends, sometimes in our fight for freedom from temptation, we got to take drastic measures. We not need, instead of driving around the hole in the street, we need to put her in reverse and run away from it, back away from it, get away from it, and go the other way. Do something drastic. Sometimes when we see the danger of our lives being crippled by this particular sin, we need to get bold and say, hey, if I'm embarrassed, if I'm running in my underwear, metaphorically speaking, I got to do whatever it takes to gain victory. I was reminded of drastic measures when I heard from a friend of mine. He is just an incredible Christian today, flourishing, but years ago he was an alcoholic and struggling horribly, just could not stop falling to the temptation of drinking. So bad, in fact, that DUIs got him in jail for a relatively long time. I mean, he was a mess. He found Jesus Christ. He found support through AA, and he found victory over his temptation. He was about sober for a year when he said, you know what, I'm worn out and I deserve a vacation. He found this great deal, this trip to Cancun, all-inclusive alcohol, one of these resorts where everywhere you turn there's a bar offering you drinks without cost, at least in that moment. And it was a bad idea. Real bad idea. He was going all by himself. He didn't tell any of his friends until he was leaving, and he called one of his friends and he's like, I just wanted to give you a heads up. If you're trying to reach me, I'm going to, get a little R&R and get away down to Cancun. And his buddy, who knew about his struggles, said, what are you thinking? That is the dumbest idea possible. And they got into a bit of a debate about it, and he said, hey, I'm going. I'm going to be okay. I haven't had a drink in a year. Well, he went down, and for a couple days, it was going okay. But the temptation was mounting. Everywhere he went, being offered a drink. And at this one bar, he pulled up to it, and he's like, I'll take a Coke. And as he took a sip of the Coke, he realized that he had been given a Coke and rum. And as he tasted the alcohol, he just was filled with a fear, a panic, a realization of how bad this decision was and how dangerous this moment was. Do you know he went back to his room, grabbed his Bible, started reading the Bible, and felt God prompt him, get on a plane tomorrow and go home. Your vacation is over. And that's what he did. Walked away from all that money invested, but you know what? He didn't care. He realized the folly of his ways, and he ran. Like Joseph running from Mrs. Potiphar, he ran from that temptation. And still to this day, my friend is living in victory because he's wising up and he's following the biblical perspective. You gotta see clearly. See and flee. Friends, can you do that? Do it now. You don't gain victory in the moment of temptation. You gain victory before it, where you think clearly about it and you say, let me think about and try to see and meditate on all these truths that bear into play when it comes to my potential fall. And let me think about what are the ways I can flee temptation. Let me research some opportunities. It's the work you do before temptation that will give you victory in temptation when clarity comes to mind and wisdom as far as what to choose is apparent. May we all fight the good fight. May we lean on the Lord and the truth of His word. And may we each increasingly gain victory in facing temptation. Would you pray with me? Lord, we thank you for your immense grace and forgiveness because we've all fallen to temptation and we all will fall again. We're so glad you forgive. Please forgive us, Lord. But God, we're not going to abuse grace by just giving in. We want lives that are beautiful. And with your Spirit's help and the wisdom of your word, particularly Joseph here, there is a way, Lord, that we can have victory. So we ask for victory. God, I pray for all of my friends who are so weary of struggling. Give them hope, give them resolve, give them help, and give them victory as they form a plan to say no to temptation. Please, God, even this week, bring great victory. We pray this in Christ's name. Amen.